Thank you all so much for being here. I'm excited to talk with you today about Read Naturally Encore. Read Naturally Encore, of course, is the paper and audio CD version of Read Naturally. It's actually the first program I ever implemented with students. When I was in high school, my senior year, I had to do a service project for the last, I think it was 3 weeks of school. Because what are seniors doing in the last 3 weeks of school? Certainly their time can be better spent servicing someone. And so what I got to do is work in the Minneapolis Public Schools. And that was the very first time I ever worked with Read Naturally with students. Of course, back then it looked different. There were audio cassettes that you had to rewind. So it definitely had a different feel. But it is the same strategy that was tried and true for over 30 years now. So today, when we're talking about Read Naturally Encore, we're going to talk very briefly about what fluency is. I'm sure most of you, if not all of you, know, but we'll just use it to lay a little common terminology. We'll mention who needs the intervention, who is the ideal candidate for using Read Naturally Encore. I'll talk about the strategy, the 3 different strategies that are used to make up the Read Naturally strategy, and briefly discuss some teacher responsibilities. We're also going to get to do an interactive activity at the end where you're going to get to walk through the steps of the program as if you are a student. It's a really powerful activity, and I encourage you to participate in it. You will need access to that handout that Christy sent in the chat box. So please be sure to have access to that for the end of the session when we get to do the interactive portion of the presentation. So let's start with talking about what fluency is. Well, fluency is one of the 5 components to teaching reading. There are these 5 different components that all need to be explicitly taught. We're familiar with all of them. From a fluency standpoint, we know it's maybe easier to identify what isn't fluency sometimes. If you picture in your mind a student that you've had who struggles with reading, and just turn on that audio portion of your brain and listen to the student read a story just for a moment. Think about some of the descriptive words you might use to describe the kind of reading you hear of a disfluent student. Many of those terms that you've thought of are probably listed on your screen now. The first word I always think of is pain. It is absolutely painful to listen to. Imagine how painful it must be to have to read that way. Yet we often ask our students to read difficult text in front of their peers. You think about how stressful that must be. It's really kind of amazing they keep coming to school. Many of us know that there's a problem with a student after as little as 15 or 20 seconds, right? You actually have a physical reaction to listening to a disfluent reader. So we also need to, of course, then know and we realize what fluency is. Fluency is the ability to read the way that you speak. It means that there's a high level of accuracy. It means you're at a rate in which you tend to hold a conversation. And there's at least some expression going on in your reading. So that is what fluency is. It is a combination of all of those things. And it's nice to listen to someone who's reading fluently. It's nicer to be able to read that way. It's more enjoyable. But the main reason we care about it is because oral reading fluency is incredibly highly correlated with reading comprehension. And this is something we've known for decades. This is one study, although there are many, many studies finding this same information. So this particular study was done on special education students. And on the left-hand side of the table, you see the measure, the way that we measure comprehension, recall, close, question answering, and so forth. And the right-hand column tells you the validity coefficients. Now, statisticians tell us that something is highly correlated if it is 0.6 or higher. Okay, so all of these measures are highly correlated with how students perform on a standardized comprehension test. But as you can see, the last item is oral reading fluency, and it is the highest correlator. This isn't the case for every student out there, of course. Nothing is. But for a vast majority of our students, their oral reading fluency is incredibly highly correlated with their comprehension. And I want to demonstrate for you why that is. Okay, so now we can't hear each other because this is a public webinar, but what I ask that you do is to read the words that you see on your screen. I'm going to ask that you read them orally and out loud. Okay, I know maybe you're in your room by yourself, but please read the words that you see on your screen out loud. When students work in Read Naturally Encore, they are always reading orally. We have no idea what a struggling reader is doing unless he's reading out loud. Okay, so I'm going to ask you to read the first line and the second line as accurately and rapidly as you can. And again, just the first and second line. You don't have to read the whole slide, but I'd like you to read the words that you see on your screen, line 1 and line 2, as accurately and rapidly as you can, and do so out loud. Please begin reading. All right, that's probably enough time for you to get through those first 2 lines of words. It's really easy. They're some of the first words you learn to read. Now what I want you to do is I don't want you to read the word. Instead, I want you to say the color that the word is written in. And again, I want you to do it out loud. I want you to do it just for the first 2 lines. And I want you to name the color as accurately and rapidly as you can. Okay, so please begin naming the colors out loud. Now, the wheels usually start to kind of come off the bus, so to speak, after the first line. If you think about whether or not that was harder or easier, I suspect it was much harder for all of you because you are proficient readers. And so you're having this internal fight. You're trying to tell your brain, stop reading, but you can't because you're absolutely automatic with reading. It's why if there's something nasty written on a bridge on your way to work in the morning, it may offend you because as soon as your eyes see it, you know what it says. We are able to dedicate our entire brains to understanding because we are absolutely automatic with reading our words. Many of us compare characters in a book to people we know in our lives, right? There's a set situation in a book that you relate to. And as you are reading, you are thinking about ways in which you can relate to these things because you are automatic. And that automaticity is what is absolutely essential for our students so that they can become good comprehenders too. Dr. Samuels was a professor at the University of Minnesota back in the 70s, and he put forth a theory called the automaticity theory. And it just deals with the fact that reading is multitasking. And if we're going to do 2 things at once, if we want to do them both well, one needs to be absolutely automatic. And so that is what we need to get our students to do. So the students who tend to be good candidates for Read Naturally Encore and Read Naturally Live, whether they're on the online program or the paper and pencil version, students who use the reading intervention are students who are below the 50th percentile on oral reading fluency norms, right? You all have different districts have different ways of identifying these students. And many, what I'm hearing from people across the country is that they have more students than ever who are struggling, right? So there's a lot of students who are in need of a fluency and comprehension intervention. Now, this table kind of zooms in a little bit more, and there's a couple things I want you to notice. First, I want you to notice, I'm going to put my cursor over on the right-hand side of my slide. I want you to notice what happens to the scores in the 6th, 7th, and 8th grade at the 50th percentile in the spring. They're about the same. Notice, between 50th and 90th percentile is somewhere between about 100 and 150 to 200 words. Because adult proficient readers read between 150 and 200 words when they're reading orally. So we don't ever want to push kids beyond that, right? It's also reassuring if you look at the numbers, if they go from the fall to the winter to the spring, students' numbers all get higher. Everybody gets better. Isn't that a relief? For those of us who work with struggling readers, that's a big relief. But sometimes it's easy to make the mistake because when you get so excited about any progress your struggling reader makes, because of course you do, right? Any progress is good. But do remember that their peers are making progress too. So let's take an example to explain this. In the fall of the year, 75th percentile third graders come in reading about 104 words. Their struggling readers at the 25th percentile come in at 59. They exit at only 91 words. So they're not even where their 75th percentile peers were at the start of the year. And we know this range is actually from 1 to 99, right? So it's a wider range. So we need our students to make more progress than their peers so they have a chance of catching up. And that is what the Read Naturally strategy is designed to do. Because we know that we want to set time aside for students to read. Independent reading time, although very important, is not going to do it for our struggling readers. Think about a student who struggles with reading. What do they do during independent reading time? The first little face that might pop into your mind is maybe a student who causes issues in the classroom during independent reading time. But that's not most of our struggling readers. Actually, most of our struggling readers just pretend to read because they want to hide the fact that they're illiterate. And it's where all of our illiterate adults learn to hide their illiteracy, was right in our classrooms. So although it's important, independent reading time isn't always sufficient. But let's say that you are able to get your students to actively read during independent reading time. You are here to learn about something that may help your kids. I suspect you are the kind of educators that take the time to figure out a way to get every kid to read during independent reading time, right? You got candy bars everywhere. You've picked out the right book and you get them to read. So let's take that scenario. In 10 minutes of independent reading, a proficient reader reads about 2,000 words. Because when he's reading in his head, he can read easily 200 words in a minute. A struggling reader who only reads 50 words in a minute, 10 minutes of reading, she's only read 500 words. So equal practice time is not equal practice. It's a disparity of 7,500 words in just one school week if this is the only time these two kids practiced. And we know the difference there, right? I actually get the chills when I present this slide because it's a massive thing that we're up against. But luckily, the Read Naturally strategy is there to help students with this by combining teacher modeling, repeated reading, and progress monitoring. So in Read Naturally Encore, the audio support is recorded onto the audio CDs. Students have headphones and their CD player, and they read along with the audio support that is read slow enough that they can actively read along with their mouths, moving their lips, whisper reading. They learn words they don't know. They solidify high frequency words that they're unsure of. The next component, repeated reading. National panel says, well, that's the best way to get better at reading. Of course, this is not rocket science. It's the best way to get better at everything is if you do it over and over again, right? And so students in Read Naturally Encore will read the same passage. It's a black line master. They're reading the same passage over and over again until they've mastered the words in that passage. And we need them to master them well enough that it transfers to new text. Okay. Progress monitoring is the way to get a kid who doesn't want to read something once. That's the way to get him to read it many times. Because every time he reads, he's timed. He has a little timer. Each kid's going to need their own timer. Sets the timer for a minute. He practices reading again. He's got further than the first time. Again, further again. He keeps making progress and he learns that he can do this. In fact, it starts to change the way he views reading because he realizes he can make progress. And that in turn changes the way he views himself. And as any educator will tell you, you have got to hook the kid. Right? Your job is half done. They're the ones that need to do the reading. So you got to hook them. And that progress monitoring is what does it. So these three strategies together make the Read Naturally strategy. Now, let's talk for a moment about teacher responsibilities when you are working with Read Naturally Encore. Of course, we have planning and setting up. We'll mention that briefly. Placing students, I will mention it briefly, but there is another webinar on placing students that will be coming next week. So placing students in Encore will be just mentioned very briefly today. So look for the additional webinar on that topic explicitly. Implementing the steps, that's when we're going to go through, you're going to walk through this as if you are a student. So you're going to need your handout for that. And finally, monitoring student performance. I'm going to do another webinar about that in about a month. That is when you actually have student data, right? You take a look at the data from the stories that the students have passed and you make decisions. And so if you're getting this up and running right now, don't worry about that yet. That'll come. And I'll have another training on that in a little while. So let's start talking about planning and setting up. Whenever you're thinking about setting up, you want to ask yourself, is the way I'm setting up, is the decision I am making going to increase the number of words that my students read? Is it going to increase the amount of time that the student is in the act of reading? Okay. You always want the students to be in the act of reading as much as possible. It's the only way they're going to catch up, is if they are actively reading. When you're setting up your workspace, you will be using Read Naturally Encore typically as in a resource room, a reading lab, a computer lab, before or after school. It can also be in a classroom station, right? You split your group up, got a para working with some, a teacher working with some. But you need a student to teacher ratio of about 1 teacher to every 6 students. Because there are moments where the student needs you. And so you need to have, each student will be working on their own level, in their own program, on their own story. But they come to certain steps where they need the teacher support. And so in order to come to them quickly enough, you need to have a decent student teacher ratio. If you can't get this good of a student teacher ratio, try to get in a good parent volunteer, or maybe split the group into smaller sections. So that you can manage the group. Ideally, you will use the program 30 minutes a session, 3 to 5 days a week. And I would recommend 30 to 45 minutes. If you have more time to devote to it, that's great. As with anything, the more time you put into it, the more you get out of it. The materials in Read Naturally Encore, we can have our 24 nonfiction stories in each level. You can see on the left-hand side, the student has a folder. She's reading her passage off of paper. Now, Read Naturally Live is one of the 4 programs in our online program. The online version of Read Naturally is called Read Live. And the counterpart to Read Naturally Encore is Read Naturally Live. And the steps are the same. It's just one is doing it online and the other one's doing it in the paper version. If anybody is interested in trying our online version, there's always a 60-day free trial that is available to any student. We will get that link to the free trial in that chat box during the presentation here. If you want to try Read Live, the online version, it has 4 programs within it. Please feel free to sign up for that 60-day free trial, and you can try that. No cost to you for as many students as you want. And again, that link will be in the chat box in a minute. But the sample story on the left-hand side, as you can see in Read Naturally Encore, there are keywords with definitions. There's a place for a prediction. There's a numbered passage so student can quickly calculate their words correct per minute score. There are graphs. So students color in how far they got on their first timing on a story. They color in how far they got on their final timing on a story. And that's very motivating. They're also keeping track of their quiz questions. How do they do on each kind of quiz question? It will help you identify specific kinds of comprehension questions. So you can see this particular student graph. Main idea is always the first question. And this student is getting main idea questions wrong more often than right. So I know that this particular student who did this report, she's struggling with main idea. She's doing pretty well in the other areas, but that is a very important piece of information that will help me drive my instruction. Students can type a retell. Now we do have a Phonics series that's available in Read Naturally Encore as well as the online program. And if the student's working in the Phonics series, they have a word list and a spelling activity. Okay, so there's a little difference between the sequence series and the Phonics series. The audio is built in, or is in the online program, the audio is built into the computer, but in the paper version, you get an audio CD. There's 2 passages, the audio support for 2 passages on each CD. It includes the keywords, the reading of the story, as well as all of the all of the glossary words, all the words that are bolded in the story are defined on the audio CD as well. When you're preparing for students in Read Naturally Encore, you are going to be running copies of the stories, okay? Split them into 2 groups of 12. Have all your odd stories in one packet and all your even stories in another packet, okay? So there's 24 nonfiction stories in each level. You are going to run copies of these. You are going to put them into 2 different sections. Each level will have part 1 and part 2. First, your odd stories, then your even stories. This will allow all of the CDs to remain in circulation because each CD has an odd story and an even story on it. One CD has story number 1 and story number 2. And so that will allow it so that as many students as possible can be using those audio CDs. Each student needs a digital timer, a headset, and a CD player or a device to play. Our audio, the timers need to have an audio sound. So they need to let you know when the minute is up. They need to be exact. So they have to be digital. And they should not count down the seconds. If they count down the seconds, your kids are going to be spending the whole time checking how many seconds they have left. So we sell timers. We even have a words correct per minute calculator timer, but you don't need our timers. Any timer will work if it's digital, if it has an audio sound, and if it doesn't count down the seconds. The curricula options within Read Naturally Encore depend on what has been purchased at your site, but we do have the Sequence Series, 1st through 8th grade, the Phonics Series, which is available at 0.8, so 1st grade through early 3rd grade, and the Idioms Series. The Sequence Series has a vocabulary lesson and a retell, whereas the Phonics Series has a phonics lesson and a word list. So students do a little bit different activity at the start and at the end. There's also some encoding spelling practice that they get. And the Idiom Series, the main difference really is that the keywords are phrases and they're trying to explain the different meanings of idioms. So as I mentioned, before students can start working in the program, they need to be placed. We're not going to get into very deep details about placement. But it's important that you know that each student is individually placed into Read Naturally Encore. It takes about 5 minutes per student. You will use the packet that came along with your materials that's called the placement packet. We have it downloadable from our website as well, if you prefer that. And next week, there's a webinar that is just on that topic. So feel free to tune into that. Now we get to talk about implementing the steps. So now we get to do my favorite part of the presentation, and I ask that you participate with me. What we're going to do is we're going to walk through you experiencing the steps as if you were a struggling reader. So on your handout, I think it is page 18. So go to the handout link. I believe the link to the handout is the second link in the chat box. Maybe Christy, if you could put it in there again so it comes up as the most recent one. Thank you. So if you haven't clicked on it already, go ahead and click on the link that was just sent through in the chat box. Page 18 of that handout has a passage that you are going to practice as if you were a struggling reader. What I want to happen in this is a couple things. One, I want you to know what it feels like to be struggling, okay? And 2, I want you to understand how and why the program works. You know how I said earlier that we need to get kids to buy in or it's not going to work? If you don't get the kids buy-in into a program, you got a really big uphill battle. The same goes for teachers. If you are going to implement this program, you need to know on a personal level that it is effective for your students. And so that's what this activity will do. So on page 18 of your handout, you have a passage that looks like this. For those of you who haven't figured it out already, this passage is missing its vowels. Okay, so if these words look like they're all misspelled or there's some big problem, what we have done is we have taken the vowels out of every single word in the Killer Bee passage. Now, this is very important. All Read Naturally stories have vowels, okay? We would never do this to a struggling reader, all right? But we have to do it to you because you're a proficient reader. So we took this passage and we took all the vowels out of it so that you would have a hard time reading. You would know what it feels like to be struggling. If I were to ask one of you to get up in front of a group of your peers and read this passage without the vowels out loud, unpracticed, my guess is most of you would put your heads down if we were in a classroom and hope I didn't call on you, right? We ask our kids to do that all the time, read unpracticed, difficult text in front of their peers. So the next page of your handout is the graph. Each student will have a graph, so they can graph their cold scores, they can graph their hot scores, they can graph their comprehension questions, okay? So you have that in your handout as well. Now, I can't see any of you, but I suspect many of you are practicing. You're trying to figure out what those words mean. And even though our students might pretend like they don't care that they struggle with reading, of course they care. And they don't like to not know either. Okay, so this is, you can see from a personal experience what that feels like. So please pull up page 18 of that handout that's linked in your chat box. I'm going to select the story for you. Now, your kids can pick any of the nonfiction stories in the level you place them in. They're not ordered in any way, so let your kids pick. Okay, but I'm not going to do that for you, so I apologize. But for the purposes of this exercise, we're going to do Killer Bees. Now, it's important to know that each of your students is going to be placed in a different level. They're going to be working on a different story and at a different step at a different time. Okay, we're walking through this as a group for this activity only. Your kids will not do this as a group. This is an individualized program. You meet each kid exactly where he is. Okay, it's one of the biggest strengths of the program. All right, so what I'm going to ask you to do now is read the keywords along with me. I am going to read them for you. I am going to be the audio CD. I want you to read out loud along with me. Okay, so on the top of the page, right under where it says review keywords, please pull up that page so you have it easily available, whether it's printed out or on your screen, and read along with me as best you can. Here we go. Gentle. Gentle means mild or not likely to cause harm. Mean. When an animal is mean, it is easily upset and does not act in a nice way. Swarm. A swarm is a big group of insects, often bees, moving together. Chase. Chase means to follow something in order to catch it. Okay, so your students will pick their story, they'll get their CD, they'll read along with the audio CD with their keywords and definitions just like we did. Now they're going to jot down a quick prediction about what they think the story should be about. I recommend having your students include one or two of those keywords in the prediction. But this is not meant to be a big writing activity. This should only take 1 or 2 minutes. Okay, so some kids will try to stall out here. They can set their timer for 2 minutes, and at the end of 2 minutes, regardless of where they are at, they should move on to the next step, which is the cold timing step. Now, ideally, you will be with your students for the cold timing, at least for the first 3 stories. Okay. If your student-teacher ratio is such that you can't be with them all throughout the year, you can allow students to do their own cold timing. But at first, you need to do it with them for a few reasons. One, you need to teach them how to do it. So doing the cold timing with them is important. 2, you want your curriculum-based measurement data to be accurate at the beginning of this intervention. So you will only have an accurate cold timing score if you are with them. So be with them for the first 3 stories so that you can take an average of their first 3 cold timing scores and have an accurate number. Right? So you want to teach them how to do it. You want to have an accurate place to start, and you want to make sure that they did placement correctly. They're in the right level. As I know you know, struggling readers are really inconsistent. They have really good days. They have really bad days. So if placement day was off, you may need to adjust it. And if you don't know the accuracy on their cold timing score, it's a lot harder to figure out if they're in the right spot. Okay, so be with them for their cold timing. Now, when they're on their own, which you guys are going to be, I'm not in your rooms with you right now. What I ask you to do is when you come to a word you don't know, I want you to underline that word and keep reading. Now, if your passage is on the computer screen, obviously you're not going to be writing on your screen. So go ahead and just make a little check mark on a piece of paper on your desk. So if you come to a word you don't know, mark a little check mark and then keep reading as best you can. Okay, I'm going to time you for a minute. When I time kids reading, I don't say ready, set, go. It's not a race. I say when I hear your voice, I'll start the timer. Now, I can't hear your voices, but I will say that and I will click the timer and I ask that you begin reading out loud at that point. Okay. I want you to notice as you're doing this cold timing how much you don't want to underline things or make a check mark for an error. You want to give yourself the benefit of the doubt, just like your kids. They're not bad. They're not cheaters. They're just giving themselves the benefit of the doubt. Okay. So I'm going to time you reading this passage for 1 minute. So please be reading under where it says read the story in your handout. And here we go with my intro and I will start the timer. Here we go. I will start my timer when I hear your voices. Timer started. Okay, stop. That's a minute. Draw a line after the last word you read correctly. Bring your finger over to the left margin on that piece of paper. So if your finger is pointing to number 84 or 90, the next word in is the next number. So if you're pointing to 90 at the margin, the first word after the first word of that line is 91, then 92, 93, and so forth. Okay, so count over until the last word you attempted. And write that number on a pad of paper on the bottom of your page. That's the number of words you attempted. Now go back and count how many check marks you made or how many words you were willing to underline and identify as errors. We're going to call those your errors. Okay. So do the math. Take the number of words you attempted, subtract the number of errors you admitted to, and that'll give you a words correct per minute score, which then you can graph on your graph. So go ahead and in your handout, look at your graph, kind of put your finger on the line as to where you are. Now, when your students graph their cold timing score, they know what their goal is. The words correct per minute story goal is assigned to a student when they are placed into the program. So students know what their story goal is. I haven't given you a story goal yet. Okay, but you might remember back when I showed you that oral reading fluency norms table, do you remember I said adult proficient readers read somewhere between 150 and 200 words in a minute, right? So your goal is 150. Now, I'm guessing none of you got there. If you did, it would be an indication that it's too easy. You do not want your kids reaching their goal on their cold timing. Okay, you want them to have to work hard to get to that goal. Okay, so now we know where we're at. We know where we need to be. Now we're going to read along with the audio. I'm the audio. I'm going to be the CD. We are only going to read along one paragraph. Okay, but please know your students will read the entire paragraph. I mean, sorry, not the entire paragraph. We'll read the entire passage. Every time they read along with the audio CD, they will read the whole passage. Okay, you and I are just going to read the first paragraph because I want to demonstrate something to you. But just remember, your kids will read the whole passage. The other thing is there's typically students read along 3 times, but older students and students reading close to grade level, they don't need all 3 read alongs. So they usually read along once or twice. So you and I are going to be in the older student group, no offense, but that's where we're putting you. And we're just going to read along 2 times. Okay, so I want you to read that passage with me out loud as best you can. Okay, you're investing your valuable time. Please read along with me out loud so you can get the most out of this activity and really understand how the program works on a personal level. So here we go. Please read out loud with me as best you can. As I'm doing that, I want to mention something. I want you to notice a few things. First, I want you to notice how glad you are you have me. And that for a struggling reader, having audio support in something that's hard can be a relief. Second, I want you to notice how glad you are I'm going slowly. The audio support is slow enough that you can actively read along out loud with your mouth. Okay. And finally, I want you to notice how many words you thought you knew, but you didn't, and how your attention is naturally drawn to them. So it's okay if kids don't realize they made a mistake. They'll learn it here in the read along. All right, so here we go. Read along out loud with me as best you can. Bees are very important. They make honey and help crops to grow. There are many kinds of bees. One kind is gentle, but it does not work hard. Another kind of bee is very mean, but it is a hard worker. This bee makes much more honey than the gentle bee. One man thought that mating these 2 bees would be a good idea. He thought crossing the 2 kinds of bees would make a gentle, hard-working bee. That was a big mistake. All right, we're going to stop there. Normally, your kids will read the whole passage. We're just doing the first one. Now we're going to read the passage one more time, just the first paragraph again. This time, I want you to notice I go a little faster. So does the audio support on your CDs, okay? Because you're a little more familiar. Also, I want you to start adding expression. This is the 3rd time you're going to have read this passage. You should start to mimic my expression, okay? So here we go, reading it that first paragraph one final time. Then we're just going to have you practice reading the story once and we'll be done. Okay, so here we go. Please read along with me as best you can for the final read along. Bees are very important. They make honey and help crops to grow. There are many kinds of bees. One kind is gentle, but it does not work hard. Another kind of bee is very mean, but it is a hard worker. This bee makes much more honey than the gentle bee. One man thought that mating these 2 bees would be a good idea. He thought crossing the 2 kinds of bees would make a gentle, hard-working bee. That was a big mistake. All right, now we're going to do one practice. Okay, and then you're going to be done with the experiment. But kids will practice many times before they reach their goal. Okay, but we just want to see if you got better. And so I'm going to time you reading this passage out loud for the final time. Okay, and we can wrap up with questions. But as you're practicing, I want you to take note of what happens to you when we get to the second paragraph that we did not practice together. Okay, so I'm going to time you the same way I timed you before for this one last portion of this interactive activity. So when I hear you begin reading the story, when I hear your voices, I will start my timer. Timer started. Okay, stop. All right, you draw a line after the last word you attempted. Did you get better? You did. What happened to you when you got to that second paragraph that we didn't practice together? You probably slowed down. You lost your confidence, right? So you can see the importance of teacher modeling. You can see how much that helped you. Now, if you think about, was it harder to read that second paragraph that we didn't practice together? Or was it harder to the very first time you read that first paragraph? Which one was harder? The very first time you read that first paragraph, or coming to that second paragraph that you hadn't practiced together, that you hadn't read yet? The very first time you read the first paragraph is harder, because some of the words from the first paragraph show up in the second paragraph. So you learned them, you already knew them. So you can see that it transfers to new text, right? And that's the important part. Now, your kids will keep practicing. They're going to practice until they reach their goal. So my guess is most of you didn't reach 150. If somebody did, that would mean the goal is too easy for you. You'd want to raise the goal. So your kids will keep practicing here until they reach their goal independently. Then they go on and answer their quiz questions. And to pass the student, this is an important piece of information. This is what is required for each student to pass. They need to, number one, reach their goal rate, their story goal of words correct per minute. Whatever their story goal is, that's the number they need to reach. 2, they need to do so accurately. So they can only have 3 or fewer errors in a 1-minute timing. Okay, so rate, meet their goal, accuracy, 3 or fewer errors. The third thing, expression. They have to at least have some. We have a score of 1 to 4, scores of 2 and higher pass the student on expression. Finally, they need to have their comprehension questions done correctly. Okay, so they need to do those things in order to pass. Then they can graph how far they got in red, right on top of the blue. You can see here, this red score is their final timing right on top of their blue. Then they can fill in their comprehension questions, do their retell or their word list, depending on whatever series the student is working in. And then they can go and pick another story until you think they're ready for a higher level or a higher goal. Now, monitoring student performance, we are not going to talk about today. There is a lot of data that's collected on this graph. And so that will be what we talk about in about a month when I do a webinar on data analysis. Okay, so thank you all very much for being here. Christy, were there any questions that came through that you want me to answer before we wrap up today?
We do have a question, Claire, but I just want to remind everybody quickly that we'll be sending out follow-up emails with links to the webinar recording in about 24 hours. And to please feel free to share that with their colleagues. And also there'll be survey questions that will appear on the screen after the webinar. So if they could please answer those, that would be great. So we can continue to improve the educational experience for all of you in our future webinars. We did have a question. Ideally, how many stories should students pass each week?
Oh, that's a great question. I should have mentioned that. So ideally, if your students are meeting 3 days a week for 30 minutes, they should get through 2 stories in a week. Now, that's not week 1 or week 2, but once everybody's comfortable, if you're meeting 5 days a week for 30 minutes, they should get through about 3 stories in a week. And you want them to get through as many stories as possible. The kid who passes the most stories is going to be your kid who makes the most progress because he spent most time in the act of reading. So keep track of how many stories each kid passes each week and have an incentive for that. Keep track of how many stories the whole team, the whole group passes each week. So there's a little peer pressure to stay on task. Those are both very important things. Now I want to mention something about this. There's a QR code on your website. Feel free to scan that with your phone. It will take you to a landing page that's easily shareable if you're inclined to share with your colleagues. There's always that 60-day free trial of Read Live. There's also a free trial of Encore, the paper version, if you have colleagues who want to try out that paper version. We've never had a sales force. We're still owned by the teachers who created this program over 30 years ago. We rely on teachers spreading the word about their success. So please feel free to do that. I do see one other question came through about grading the retell. That's a great question, and it is totally subjective. You can grade it as harshly or as as easily depending on each kid. In fact, you can even skip it. I have students who are reading multiple years below grade level. I might not feel I have the luxury to work on writing yet. Okay, so if you skip it, maybe you want the student, maybe if it's an English language learner and you want them to give you an oral retell so they can practice speaking. Okay, maybe you just don't want them worried about writing yet and you want them in the act of reading, so you can skip it. But if writing is something you're tasked with, you might decide that they need to have proper capitalization, punctuation. Maybe if they're a little older, they need a topic sentence and supporting details. So it's as much or as little as you want to give it. What they graph on their report is the number of words written in the retell during 5 minutes. They should not spend 15 minutes on the retell. 5 minutes, set their timer for 5 minutes, and after that, they're done. Because remember, you want them in the act of reading as much as possible. We need to check for comprehension, but if they're going to catch up, they have to practice their reading. If a student does not pass a story, do we repeat the story? Great question. Depends on what they didn't pass. Let's say the student doesn't reach the goal rate of words correct per minute. You have the student redo the past timing. Okay. Let's say the student has 6 errors. Maybe you have them go back and read along again because they don't know the words well enough. Okay. They need to learn the words. Maybe they had 4 errors. And so you can just tell them quick what those 4 errors were, and you can do another past timing at that moment. For the quiz, they're going to get quiz questions wrong, but have them go back and correct them. Okay, so as soon as once they identify which ones they got wrong, have them go back, find the answer in the story and correct them. So you don't send them all the way back to the beginning. You just send them to a task that makes sense for whatever part that they didn't pass. So if they're not knowing the words, they could read along again. They're going to have to do another past timing for you so they can prove to you that they can read at the rate and be accurate doing so. Thank you all so much for your time and attention today. I hope to see you all in upcoming webinars. Have a wonderful afternoon.